Yesterday, I spoke with Michelle Gay, whose daughter Joey was one of the 26 and 7-year-olds killed in Newtown. And while Michelle and her family continue to mourn, she's also taken action. Co-founding the group Safe and Sound, I talked to her about why gun control is not part of that group's platform and what is. Michelle, it's good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
More than 2.5 years since your daughter Joey, 19 other 6 and 7-year-olds, 6 adults were killed, obviously, in Newtown. Are schools safer today than they were in that December?
You know, I think for the most part, yes. I think nationally we have a greater awareness now, and that's where the change begins. I think we still have a lot of work to do, in some places more than others, for sure. But
did this presidential task force, I know it had no money attached, and it's always about the bottom line. Did this presidential task force on school safety, did that help at all, or was it just sort of a rhetorical flourish?
You know, I think it depends who you ask.
I'm asking you.
Again.
You know. What's the answer?
Again, I think it goes to awareness, and any bit of awareness, any bit of push that we can get, especially from, you know, the federal government, is always really helpful.
Before we talk about the group that is dedicated, you're running, that's dedicated to making safer schools, just so we don't scare people at home more than they need to be, schools are still a pretty safe place for kids to be, are they not, despite the horror that you and others have lived through, right?
Yeah, I think we get a bit sidetracked by the way that these national events, school-based tragedies, affect us. And the reason they affect us so much is because these are the most sacred places in our country. And when something happens there, it lets us know that even though it's rare, it's something that possibly could happen in our community.
Well, we also give up our kids to entrust them to others.
Every
supposed to
every day.
So Safe and Sound's the name of the organization. I went on your website. Gun control is not part of the deal. Is that because after Newtown, you're convinced it's never, or at least not going to happen in the short future? Why was that decision made?
Deliberate choice on our parts. You know, I've been in education. I'm 42
you were a teacher,
years
right?
old.
Weren't you?
Yeah. So I've seen a fair amount of these school-based tragedies, and I've seen a sort of a pattern of response following each one, especially those that involve any kind of gun violence. So there is this national argument that ensues immediately. There are calls for more legislation. There's demands for change. There are emotional pleas and speeches, but I don't see us moving the ball forward enough.
On that front.
Yeah, I really don't.
On your website,
I think in terms of safety, I think that argument is not necessarily getting us anywhere at this point. So we chose to pick a totally different path.
Yeah, I want to talk about the different path. On your website, first thing that pops up is 28 states lack basic measures to safeguard kids in child care and in schools. What are the basic measures that more than half the states don't have? What are they?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are access control, monitoring who's coming and going from your school, making sure that it's not just wide open to the public during school hours or after school hours. For some, it's physical, the physical plant itself, just things like the traffic pattern, things like bus safety, you know, even things like fire safety that many of us are taking for granted. Those are basics that we need to be seeing in our schools.
Donald Trump said the other day that he thought that teachers should be armed, should have guns. Should they?
You know, I'm a teacher, and when I signed up to teach, I never envisioned sitting crisscross applesauce with my students on the floor with our readers and a sidearm on my hip. If we get to that point, and that's the only way for us to be able to safely educate our students, then by all means, we're going to have to talk about that. But right now, there are so many other interventions.
Yeah, give me a few. What are the interventions that are accessible and doable in the short run? What are they?
Yeah, well, to the topic of arming staff, you know, we have a position invented nationally in our schools called the school resource officer. We also have school security officers. Those are trained law enforcement professionals, and they're not just trained in sort of everyday community policing. These folks have training above and beyond that to help them incorporate into our schools.
And it's one thing to arm them. Do you not worry, though, as a former teacher, the notion, number one, the notion of a teacher having a gun, and no matter how much training, him or her being able to use it competently, and secondly, what kind of atmosphere does that create in a classroom when it's likely your kids are going to know the teacher, whom I respect, is carrying a weapon with him or her? I mean, is that not...
It would be a huge culture shock for us, so it would be very difficult for us to go from where we are now to that point right now, and I don't know that we need to. I also feel that the amount of training that you said, that you brought up, I mean, that's just think about how much training we give our law enforcement officers, and you know, in the moment, in an emergency, it just doesn't always go the way that we want it to.
What's the most important thing a parent concerned about safety in their school for their kids? What's the one most important contribution they can make?
They got to get involved. They have to come, they have to show up, they have to offer their support, and they have to pull up a chair at the table.
How hard, you know, I admire that you're not just mourning, as I'm sure you do, but trying to do something. But for you to talk about safer schools, you have to talk about the most unsafe of schools, where your daughter Josephine was. How hard is this to do this campaign when what's under the surface everywhere is you lost your little girl?
It's personal. It's absolutely personal. But again, that's motivation for me. That's why I'm out there doing this. That's why I'm out there working in schools across the country, because I do believe that we can do so much better, and that it's not nearly the rocket science. It's not nearly as far off in the distance as I think folks think it is.
Tell us something about Joey. We know how she died. We don't know how she lived. You do. Tell us a little bit.
With a lot of spontaneity and joy. Very, very silly girl. Very funny, very affectionate, very loving, very attached to her family and her friends, her teachers, and the school community that was Sandy Hook.
And one of her teachers also died trying to protect her, I know, at Newtown.
Right. Her one-on-one aide died there in the classroom with her, as well as her substitute teacher. One
last thing. When you wake up or you turn on the television and you hear about yet another school shooting, I know a college is obviously very different from an elementary school. What happens in your head? What does that feel like in your body? What's that like?
It hurts. It takes you right back there, for sure. I think what hurts the most right now is just knowing on some level what those families and what that community is dealing with, what they're grappling with. And I think too, it was difficult for us to be in that spot, to be worried about, how am I going to get the right foot in front of the left foot? How am I going to feed my family? How am I going to continue? While the rest of the nation, or seemingly so, you know, tends to step up and become embroiled in a lot of arguing and a lot of impassioned, you know, arguments. That's tough.
Michelle, thanks for being here, and thanks for your work. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Michelle and others from Safe and Sound are hosting a free event at Boston University on Thursday, October 22nd. It's aimed at students, educators, first responders, to talk about how we can make schools safer. You can find more information at safeandsoundschools.org.